Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, or whatever time zone you are joining us from. My name is Elena Sokova. I'm the Executive Director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And I'm delighted to welcome you to a virtual panel discussion on LGBT plus identity in the nuclear weapons space, featuring government officials and independent experts who are members and allies of the queer community. Representatives from this community were long excluded from the historically male and heteronormative nuclear weapon space. Their identities and ways of life were thought to be incompatible with national defense, international security, and arms control negotiations. And while we've seen some progress in this area, we have a long way to go to achieve LGBT plus inclusion, participation, and visibility in nuclear policy. This conversation is timely and necessary for many reasons. The mere announcement of the event generated an avalanche of mockery and trolling of the event. A knee-jerk reaction for me was, maybe we should delete some of these comments, but we decided not to go that route. And just to make sure, there were very many positive comments as well, and a lot of support from along all the participants from the big non-proliferation disarmament community. But these comments clearly demonstrate the challenges and the attitudes that still exist in our policy space with regard not only the inclusion, but even acceptance of queer colleagues. My hope that some of these so-called commentators actually watch the event and the discussion and hopefully change, if not their beliefs, but at least their behavior. In order to create a safe and respectful environment, we have disabled the chat function on Zoom, but doesn't mean that we are not looking for your questions and active participation. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom, or send us your questions through email at events@vcdnp.org. I would also like to emphasize that by participating in this event or any other event of the VCDNP, you also agree to abide by the VCDNP responsible and respectful behavior policy. And we did include the link to it in our announcements. So I hope that allows us to have a very, very focused, substantive discussion without thinking about some interruptions and inappropriate comments. And finally, before I pass the microphone to the VCDNP Research Associate, Reitmann, who should get a full credit for the idea of this event and the concept and all the communication. So many thanks for that. He will moderate the event and introduce our speakers. And I wanted to say that I'm honored and proud to work along with many other colleagues in the nuclear policy field, but also here at the VCDNP. I'm grateful to have representatives of this community with us. I'm also grateful and appreciate our today's speakers' agreement to speak and make themselves available. And I'm really, really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you all, and Louis, the microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, Elena, for your kind words and for your support in organizing this event at the VCDNP. This is my first time moderating a VCDNP panel, and I really couldn't be more thrilled that with today's star-studded panel, we will explore the topic of LGBT plus identity in the nuclear weapons space. I'm delighted that we're able to bring you a panel that combines decision makers and experts from a diversity of perspectives in this field, in the spirit of diversity and inclusion. So as moderator, I will ask each of our panelists some questions, one after the other, and then we will open the floor to questions from the online audience. Let me remind you that you can submit questions via the Q&A function here on Zoom, or send an email to events@vcdnp.org. And please be aware that this event is being recorded. So without further ado, let me introduce our fantastic speakers. First, we have Richard Johnson. He is US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Policy. In this role, he recently oversaw and coordinated the development of the 2022 Nuclear Posture Review. He has a long list of equally impressive previous job titles, including Senior Director for Fuel Cycle and Verification at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, Assistant Coordinator and Acting Deputy Lead Coordinator for Iran Nuclear Implementation at the State Department, and Director for Nonproliferation at the National Security Council in the Obama administration. Thank you for joining us, Richard. Our next speaker is Her Excellency Ambassador Laura Holgate. She is the US Permanent Representative to the International Organization in Vienna, her second time holding this role. A founding member of the Nuclear Threat Initiative in 2001, Ambassador Holgate was Vice President for Materials Risk Management at NTI from 2018 to 2021. As a leading voice on nuclear security, she previously served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for WMD Terrorism and Threat Reduction on the National Security Council, and she was the US Sherpa to the Nuclear Security Summit. Welcome, Laura. Thank you for joining us. Next up, we have Ray Acheson. They are the Director of Reaching Critical Will, which is the disarmament program of the world's oldest feminist peace organization, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. They're one of the most prominent disarmament activists, serving on the steering committees of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, Stop Killer Robots, and the International Network on Explosive Weapons. They also provide analysis and advocacy at the UN and other disarmament forums, and have authored 2 books that could not be more relevant for today's discussion: Banning the Bomb, Smashing the Patriarchy, and Abolishing State Violence. And finally, I'm especially delighted that she's here today. Anuradha Damale-Day is an eminent expert on outer space and disarmament issues, and works as a policy fellow at the British American Security Information Council in London, while also conducting her PhD research on responsibility in outer space within the Third Nuclear Age project at the University of Leicester. Additionally, Anu heads basics diversity and inclusion work, including under the Emerging Voices Network, and she also leads the UK branch of Women of Colour Advancing Peace and Security. Welcome, Anu. Thank you all for joining us. I want to get straight into the questions, and I'd like to start with Richard. Richard, you're a senior official working on some of the most sensitive and high stakes issues imaginable, WMDs and nuclear deterrence. Queer people were long shut out from careers in government and in the military in the US, but also worldwide. So I'd love to know what has changed since you started your career in government about 15 years ago, and how have you navigated being a gay man working in a historically heteronormative environment with traditional ideas of masculinity?
Well, first of all, let me just say thank you so much to you, Louis, and to Elena and to VCDNP for hosting this event. I think it's incredibly important and timely, as was noted. Unfortunately, we had been reminded of why this is important, but I was very pleased to see the strong amount of support from this incredible community. And I'm very pleased. I hope to see a lot of familiar faces in the Q&A today. Let me also just note at the outset that I'm speaking today in my personal capacity, and my views do not necessarily reflect those of the United States government or the Department of Defense. But now, having gotten all the caveats out of the way, you're absolutely right. And I was thinking about this morning, that when I started in the US federal government back in the 2006 timeframe, it had basically been 10 years or even less since the United States government had said that LGBT people, queer people, could get security clearances. All the way up into the 90s, in the Clinton administration, there were still caveats and restrictions on queer people, gay people, bisexual people, trans people, lesbians getting security clearances. That was because it was deemed in society to be a negative to be who you were. And if somebody were to know that you were queer, that was seen as a blackmailable offense, and thus potentially made you open to the idea that you could not be trusted with classified national security information. That was in the 1990s. And so when I started in 2006, the good news is that we had moved on from that. The good news was I was actually hired in part by a gay man, a man who became our first openly gay US ambassador in Asia. But at the same time, I think the system had not yet adjusted to the idea of sort of open service. And frankly, in the US military, we still did not have open service. We still had don't ask, don't tell. And so I can recall lots of experiences where, and I should say I had just come out really only within the last year before I started. So I was still adjusting to myself, much less working in a space and being myself. And I can think of many moments where we were not in a space that was welcoming. And really that's what this is about, is making sure that we remember that despite the comments we saw online about what does this have to do with nuclear weapons, all of these spaces are about people. And the only time that we are able to do good work on policy, whatever your views may be, and I really appreciate that we have a diversity of policy views represented on this call today, this is really about having the right people in the space to be able to provide good policy views from across a perspective. And if you have a space where people don't feel welcome and don't feel like they can be open-minded and speak their minds, you're not going to have that ability to have a good policy discussion. I can recall being told by the regional security officer in the embassy in Beijing that being gay was illegal in China. I was living in China at the time. That actually was not true. It was not true. It had not been true for some time. But I was told, don't go out, don't go to gay bars, just avoid it. That's the old way of thinking, but that was something that happened in 2007. I can recall being in rooms in a young part of my career where I was surrounded by a lot of people in uniforms, and all of whom were white, cis, and male, and straight, apparently, at least to my own knowledge. And I did not feel comfortable necessarily speaking up in that space because I did not serve in the military. I opened my mouth, and I don't necessarily have the definition of a masculine voice. And I may feel intimidated to be part of this community, though I think my views are valid, as is everyone else's. I'll even tell you one more story. The first time I went to Vienna, I ended up meeting up with a friend of mine in the lobby of the hotel who also happened to be a gay man. And he invited me to drinks later with his boyfriend. And I felt so embarrassed to do so that I ended up sneaking out of the hotel room in the evening so that my colleagues did not see me, so that I did not have to have the conversation with them about where I was going and who I was meeting with, just to have a drink. And so I guess the last thing that I'll say is that sounds like it's all sort of ancient history, but I think it is not. It is something that we need to deal with today to allow a community to feel welcome in this space so that we can do the good work that we face. And this is often the case still with individuals interacting with foreign officials outside of, say, the United States, in my case, in governments and in places where being queer is still very much not accepted at all, much less partially. And I've had many experiences where I've had diplomats ask me, where's your wife? Where are your children? And that can be a very intimidating discussion to have when you have to reveal yourself about who you are, knowing you also have to interact with them on a professional basis. And so, lots to be said here, and I don't want to take up the time because there's a lot of other more important voices to be heard in some ways here, but I just appreciate this discussion and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. I have to say I'm really grateful for your frankness and for sharing those personal stories. I can say that I've certainly felt like that myself a fair few times. So I want to ask a follow-up question, since you'd mentioned some of these points, reflecting on your own life and those of other queer people that you know. What do you think the experiences are that us queer people share, that bring us together as a community? And how do you think they affect who we become? And then do you think that your life experiences as a gay man, your identity, shape your style of work, the way that you engage with colleagues and counterparts?
These are great questions. Thank you for having this discussion. I think first we have to acknowledge that all queer people, like all people in the world, are different. I will acknowledge I have a certain amount of privilege as a white man in the United States, cisgendered, identifies as male. My experiences are going to be different than those as somebody who identifies as a different gender, who is transgendered, who is a person of color, etc. But I do think that there are probably some overarching themes that we can talk about, and at least from my own personal experience, one of those is I really appreciate that in this community we have often had to fight, frankly, to be heard and to get our voices heard, whatever those views may be, and that often means understanding how to operate in spaces where you may not be. And you will certainly not be, in some ways, a part of the majority, whatever that definition may be. And understanding how to operate in a space where you can communicate with audiences that are going to have different perspectives and different viewpoints. And I think that in a policy space, that's incredibly important. It's actually in some ways a strength that folks from this community and frankly other underrepresented communities probably have. We have an experience, possibly based on a negative experience, but translated into a positive one, of how to communicate across different audiences and how to make that connection. And so I think that by avoiding groupthink and being able to have that discussion, that is an impact that my experience has had, at least on me. It may be different for other people. I also think that this is a community, like other underrepresented communities, that has had to essentially engage in campaigns for their own civil rights. And I think there's a lot of experiences to be drawn from those kinds of movements that can be applicable in other parts of the policy community. And again, understanding how to communicate with a mass audience and interact with government officials to see change happen. I think it's really important for us to talk a little bit about the need to take advantage of all of the great talent and all of the human capital that's out there in our society. We are literally not doing our best when we don't have everybody at the table. And if people don't feel comfortable being who they are, they may not enter a space. And I always say that the nuclear space is an interesting one where you don't necessarily have to be a scientist or an engineer or a chemist to work in this space, but you have to feel like you can at least address some of those issues. And there is a barrier to entry there. And if you add on top of that issues related to your own identity and your acceptance in that community, you may feel like you are not welcome and that you may not pursue that. And so things like mentorship, long-term mentorship, building a community, which is why things in the United States, we have organizations like Out in National Security. I know there are other groups around the world that are similar. We also have other groups that we've met. WCAPS was mentioned previously, Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy. These are the sorts of organizations they can also help to remind us that, frankly, we are not alone. And I'll come back and end where I started, which is that at the end of the day, this entire community is about people. It's not about weapon systems. It's not about the engineering diagrams of enrichment plans. It's about people. And if you want to have the best people and you want to have a variety of thought to get the best policy outcomes, we have to be welcoming to all. And so I really feel strongly about that. I think discussions like this are part of that, making us a more inclusive community, not just a more diverse community, but a more inclusive community.
Thanks a lot. What a hell of a response. I thought that was fantastic. Thanks very much for sharing, Richard. But I now want to turn it over to Anu. And I want to make a quick correction just at the top of that. I said that you were heading the UK chapter of WCAPS. I understand that you've now actually focused on your many other commitments and are no longer doing that. So I just want to give that quick correction before I ask you this question. There's an excellent episode of the Pride and STEM podcast, which I recommend everyone to listen to, in which you explain that you felt overwhelmed enough entering the nuclear field as a woman of color, so much so that you couldn't deal with being openly queer as well. You also said that society's expectations of a queer woman of color would always be different than those of a white queer woman. Can you tell us more about your experience coming out when you were already working in the field, how that affected you, how it affected your work, and what those different expectations are that you feel subjected to compared to others?
Thank you, Louis, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this discussion. To be quite honest with you, first of all, I just want to say, this is a really important discussion. If you are watching this in the hope that we're going to be talking about nuclear Armageddon or whatever, I'm really sorry to break your heart on that. But I hope that you stay on and learn something from this discussion, because I think part of the big problem that this field has, and looking internally, is perception, and the way that we're perceived and the way that you have to look and act and speak in order to be taken seriously. Or in order to succeed even. Now, there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. There's always going to be people that break through the mold. And so there are a billion caveats surrounding this. But, I was, like you said, when I did Pride in STEM, I've come from a STEM background. I moved across into what I like to think of as international security rather than just nuclear. And coming from STEM, I was acutely aware already of, being someone that went to a bad school that barely had a physics teacher, going to a university where everyone went to privately educated schools and, had a lot of tacit knowledge already, that being a physics student was going to be hard. And then I, did some activism work in that space. It wasn't my main thing, and moved over to security, and boy, was it worse. It was a lot harder to push through. Not only because the field is smaller, but I think we are far more set in our ways. I have to acknowledge, yes, I'm an Indian woman, but I was born and brought up in the UK. I am still Western. All of us are still Western. We're still having a very Western focused conversation. And the reasons for that are in their platitudes. But one of the many reasons I think we need to acknowledge is rather than pointing the finger towards non-Western countries and saying, well, you're not allowed to be openly queer, we have to acknowledge the legacies of colonialism, of imperialism that took away the rights to be queer of those people in those countries. There's already a barrier to engagement for people from the global South in our field. We know that. We don't need to get the receipts out or anything like that. But add to that the layer of, you have to deal with those legacies with your own country, fight for your right to be heard within mainstream nuclear spaces, and then talk about being queer as well in a largely, in a very loving space in many ways, as we saw from a lot of the reactions to this event, but in a world that isn't as safe as we like it to be for queer people. I think it's really important to acknowledge that. And I thought I really wanted to get that out of the way before I go on to my personal experience, which was I you know, there weren't a huge amount. I don't believe that role models are the solution to everything. They're a small part of the big puzzle, but they're a necessary part of that puzzle. And where I did see women, they were largely white. They were largely, you know, dressing a certain way. They were largely presenting as feminine in the space in a certain way. And as I got to know the field more and more, I realized, yes, there is diversity in it. You know, there are organizations like WCAPS, you know, and others that do amazing work to try and, you know, institutionalize equity rather than make it a tack on. But as I have been in this field for 3 or 4 years now, I've seen that there is still a tendency to treat EDI or equity, diversity, and inclusion as a tack on rather than a strategic thing. It should be something that is core to your organization, it's core to your events, it's core to your policies. And I think I really struggled with that. You know, I really struggled with coming into this as someone who didn't come from a wealthy family, as someone who, when I was in school, didn't even know this field or this role could exist for someone like me. You know, I was talking to someone earlier today and I was like, I didn't even know about the NPT till after school. Like I didn't know it existed. And that's okay. That's okay. But I was stubborn. And I was based in London, which is a city where there is a lot of access. There's a lot of, you know, think tanks. So if I needed to, I could go and speak to these people. And there were lots of very well-meaning individuals. But I think as a field, we still struggle to innovate and to change the way that we think and change the way that we value knowledge and the way that we value knowledge production and the way we measure success. And until we really challenge that and have those difficult conversations, I don't know how we move forward. And that includes not treating EDI as a tack on, not inviting, you know, one woman of color to your event on the NPT and calling it a day. You know, that does not solve the problem. It's a plaster. It's not changing anything massively. So for me, coming out was a process. I did it in places where I felt safe. But looking left and right, it wasn't obvious to me that this was a queer space. Everyone dressed very similarly. Everyone was expected to speak a certain way. Professionalism was expected of you, and professionalism looked and felt a certain way. And it's taken me a long time to figure out how I want to exist in this field. But it was hard. And I'm now at a point where I slightly lie on the kind of, I'm going to do what I want and do my work and hope that the work speaks for itself kind of place. And I still feel that pressure sometimes when I go to conferences and when I go to large events, that I need to speak and dress and carry myself a certain way. And whether that's my own experience, whether that's, you know, a shared experience of minorities, I can't speak for everyone. None of us can speak for everyone. But I do know from speaking to fellow queer colleagues who, by the way, don't all feel comfortable coming out and talking like this about being queer for good reason, that it is a shared experience. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Anu. That's a really powerful personal story, and lots of good examples and sprinkled throughout. I'm looking at the clock, and I just want to give the audience as much of a chance to ask questions as I have. So I think we'll move it along, but I really want to come back to you, Anu, during the Q&A. So next, I would like to ask Ambassador Holgate, when we talk about participation and visibility of queer people in nuclear policy, there are some who ask, why is this important? Why care about this when there are really pressing, substantive questions? And my instinctive response is, because it's the right thing to do. But I do wonder about arguments for including queer people in nuclear policymaking and diplomacy that go beyond intrinsic value. Now, Richard's already mentioned something to this effect, but I'd love to know from you, what do you think those arguments are?
Well, thanks so much, Louie, and I really appreciate being part of this panel and to VCDNP for organizing it and you for hosting it so graciously. When when I think about the why of inclusion and diversity, including LGBTQI plus diversity, I really think about 5 reasons. And one of them is what you just said, the moral imperative of creating opportunities for all people to contribute to enterprises that they find compelling, or they feel like they have something to offer. The second reason is the argument from effectiveness. And this points to the research that we've seen in field after field, that diverse perspectives enhance policy discussions, lead to more comprehensive recommendations and more effective implementation. Simply put, diverse communities make better decisions. The third point that I point to is that today's challenges, and Richard kind of pointed at this as well, and nuclear weapons is, right up there. These are so consequential that we need all the ideas and energy we can get. We need to create space for members of underrepresented groups to contribute to the nuclear discussion and incorporate different ways of thinking and fostering creativity and innovation if we're going to get after these really huge problems. We can't leave anybody on the other side of that door. Fourthly, exclusionary thinking can lead to unintended and negative consequences. And some have said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Historically, decisions about nuclear weapons, nonproliferation, disarmament, arms control have been dominated by white heterosexual men with common backgrounds, educations, and experiences. And, it's no surprise that the resulting policies reflect a very Western-centric perspective and often neglected to identify the potential impacts on others, particularly those from historically marginalized groups. And the fifth point refers to visible representation. And here I really, tip my hat to those on the call here, because it can be hard for people from underrepresented communities to even aspire to positions within the nuclear policy community if they don't see people like them, and if they don't see people like them. And this can be especially challenging for the queer community, where people's identities may be invisible or even dangerous. And so creating a safe space in the nuclear community for queer people to be their full selves really helps build that diverse and inclusive pipeline for the future. So when I have people who challenge me on my commitment, those are the things I offer them. I say, pick whatever works for you. This is important, and there's even more reasons, for other people that can go beyond that. I'm collecting more whys as I go through my own journey in this area.
Thank you so much. I'm going to have to get that list, make sure I know that by heart. That was excellent. I'd like to ask you a quick follow-up and then turn it over to Ray. We all, maybe some of the audience don't yet know, but you are a vocal and, I might add, effective advocate for gender equality in the nuclear field. You have not only helped to create the Vienna hub of the International Gender Champions Initiative, you have also co-founded Gender Champions Nuclear Policy, which is a network dedicated to advancing gender equality and women's participation specifically in the nuclear field. So reflecting on that broad experience, what can we learn from the fight for women's participation when trying to get more queer people a seat at the table? And how do we reach and persuade those that still don't think inclusion is more than a nice to have?
Well, thank you for that, Louis. I really have been so grateful to be able to be part of the efforts to lead in promoting gender equality in the nuclear field and throughout all of the Vienna-based international organizations, through the International Gender Champions and that network of leaders devoted to making using their personal voice and their responsibilities to make change. These efforts can and should extend beyond gender. And that's one thing I'm also really pleased is that the Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy was able very quickly to embrace intersectionality when it comes to race, gender, so many other issues, and to allow those and to encourage champions to make their pledges in a much broader way than just about inclusion of women. The lessons and approaches, can apply across some of them to the LGBTQI issues. Some of the things that I think are really important and that I try to model in my own role is are some of the following. And it's comes down to allyship for me, and it's how critical it is as a manager or a supervisor to really empower early and mid-career queer individuals working in the nuclear space, paving the way for success later in their professional lives. And so that means in the workplace to create the space for discussion of DEIA issues within one's teams. And my mission has a DEIA working group, and I meet with them regularly to discuss bias and also proposing small gestures can really help. Whether it's showing up at Pride events or publicly recognizing Pride Month in one's offices, adding pronouns to one's email signature, sharing pronouns in introducing oneself to new colleagues, putting a supportive symbol or a sign on a desk indicating that your office is a safe space. Wear an ally button. These gestures can, demonstrate support for queer staff members and create a more inclusive workplace. Secondly, be an ally on social media. I mean, we're all kind of nervous about where Twitter is going, but I think it's important to seek out and, to the degree I can, to retweet, to amplify the messages and inputs and insights and sometimes jokes and silly things from my queer friends and colleagues and help lift up their voice in a broader platform. Mental health is an important issue, whether, in whatever phase of one's life or whatever one's identity may be. I have been very open about my own mental health issues and the treatment I've sought for that and the importance of that. And I think that can be especially important for queer staff and colleagues to see that model and to feel safe in doing so within their own career, because we know that statistics show that LGBTQI+ individuals are at much higher risk of facing mental health issues due to discrimination, homophobia, transphobia, social isolation, rejection. This can be an important component of showing support for your queer friends and staff. I also think it's important to take larger steps if you have that space, if you have that authority. As many of you know, in October, we lost an icon of the nuclear community, former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter. And Ash was my mentor, and he really started me and supported me along my 30-year path that would become my life's work. And as he rose in stature and influence, I watched him build diverse teams at Harvard and at the Pentagon. And I cheered when he opened all combat roles to women, when he helped overturn the misguided don't ask, don't tell policy, and when he established support system for trans and queer people in service of our nation. And so I think leaders really have a special responsibility to support and advance diversity and inclusion across the board. And finally, I think we just need to keep having conversations like this. The visibility matters. Highlighting underrepresented voices in our workforce matters. Changing mindsets is not going to happen overnight, but the more we spread awareness, the more we express solidarity publicly, the more we celebrate differences in our workspaces and beyond, we lay the groundwork for the paradigm shifts that we need for worldwide acceptance of LGBTQI communities.
That was a very comprehensive list. I know, yes, applause to that. And then also thank you for supporting this event on social media. You're certainly making true on that ambition to support your queer colleagues and friends in that space. So before I turn it over to Ray, I'd just like to invite our audience one more time to post some questions in the Q&A function here on Zoom, or send an email to events@vcdnp.org, and we will feed your questions into the Q&A. But now, talking about LGBT+ identities in the nuclear weapons space would only be half the conversation if we didn't highlight how queer people have been at the forefront of disarmament activism for a long time and have championed the ideas of queer theory. So as one of the leading experts on the topic and a prominent activist yourself, Ray, can you tell us about the central arguments of queer theory regarding nuclear weapons and how queer people have come to identify with the cause of nuclear disarmament?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Louis. So I would start out by saying, of course, there's not just one queer theory, as we can see very clearly, I think, in this discussion today. But since I only have a few minutes, I'll have to be sort of concise in how I answer this question. And the short answer that I want to convey is that queer theory has a lot to do with challenging what we consider to be normative. So with nuclear weapons, the dominant narrative is that nuclear deterrence works, nuclear weapons make the world secure and make for stable geopolitics, they prevent World War III, etc. We know all the standard arguments in defense of the persistence of nuclear weapons. So a queer perspective helps us to ask, who has decided this narrative? Who benefits from this narrative? Who's harmed by it? Whose voices are being left out? And Anu already pointed out that this conversation is also missing voices. It's a largely white global north, mostly cis conversation. So queers often ask who's being excluded and how does that shape what becomes known as the dominant theory? And then also, how is the dominant narrative gendered? What normative understandings of masculinity, femininity are underlying the assumptions and assertions being made about nuclear weapons? How does that affect nuclear weapon policy? This has a lot in common to an intersectional feminist approach for those that are more familiar with feminism. And it also looks at who's being harmed by nuclear weapon policy and discourse and activities. But a queer approach, I think the value added here is that it also helps us to break down binaries in our answers and to challenge some of the central tenets of thinking about power relationships. So when we're thinking about the nuclear weapon industry, it's highly centralized and hierarchical. It steals resources from the social good. It gaslights people into thinking that nuclear weapons keep them safe, even while putting everyone in the world in grave danger. So queer theory helps us to unpack each of these. It helps us think through how hierarchy and centralized control can stifle creativity in alternative approaches. And I think both Laura and Richard spoke to that. It provides models for non-hierarchical and non-binary and decentralized relationships, challenging notions of power and how we organize ourselves within societies or within institutions. And then queer organizing is often about redistributing resources, providing care to as many people as possible, looking at where the gaps are, where is the money going towards institutions of harm, how can that be redistributed to actually help people survive and thrive in the world. And queer theory articulates these very real harms that are caused to people and then seeks to build the systems that would actually protect people. So rather than a binary that alleges we can either have nuclear weapons or World War III, a queer approach asks, what are the other options? There has to be something in between those two options. Prevent global war without nuclear weapons? How can we emphasize investments in alternatives instead of the systems that we know cause harm? So those are just a few things, but I could probably talk about that all day.
Thank you very much, Ray. I think you're absolutely right. And we should hear more about that. But I think this very succinct overview is very important for a lot of our audience to gain a basic awareness of the central arguments that queer theories put forward. I want to ask you just one more follow-up question before entering the Q&A, because I can see questions piling into our Q&A space. I'm curious what you think about the future of queer theories and queer disarmament activism. It's said that the younger generation of queer people is perhaps more vocal about their identities, and that they're more confidently asserting their political views that are informed by those identities. So with that, do you see queer theory and activism becoming more popular?
This is a major hope of mine. And this is, of course, despite the incredibly horrific backlash that we're facing right now, particularly in the United States where I live, and particularly against trans and genderqueer and non-binary people. But the visibility that we've made and being vocal and the gains that we've made can't be taken away. So the more events like this, the more space that's shared with non-normative voices and perspectives, the more we can elevate creative organizing and solutions to a wide range of problems in the nuclear space, but well beyond it too. And I think, you know, it relates to how folks within these fields operate as well. And this gets back to something that Anu was discussing. And I think, you know, we can see a tension already between some of the different organizing models within what is broadly grouped as the LGBTQ or the queer community, right? So there's one way of operating in these spaces is a lot of mainstream organizing, say for gay rights like marriage equality or promoting access to the military, whereas a lot of other queer activists have taken issue with attempts to conform to these heteronormative approaches and relationships, because we can recognize how these institutions like the military and marriage actually can harm queer people and other non-normative people, and also how they can harm cisgendered heteronormative men and women as well. So I think one of the things I'm interested in with sort of burgeoning visibility of queer activism and organizing is the space that this will create for a more expansive understanding of justice and peace and freedom and family, and the limitations of what we have in terms of the mainstream institutions. A lot of queer organizing that we have right now focuses on mutual aid from position of promiscuous care, going beyond, for example, the nuclear family, if you will, and building alternative kinds of relationships and organizing support for each other and other people in different configurations. And of course, you don't have to be queer to engage in any kind of organizing or thinking, but a lot of that type of work has really been generated by queer activists, and also, speaking from a North American perspective, as I am, from Indigenous and Black folks and other people of color, anyone who's been systematically marginalized and excluded from state institutions, from care, from society. And so I think that as we continue down this path of visibility and emboldened speech and being able to operate more freely as queer people within different spaces, we can hopefully bring some of this more radical queer organizing and thinking and theory into what have been traditionally very narrow-minded, closed fields, and really challenge the existence of many of these institutions and consider what alternatives we need to provide for well-being of everyone in the world.
Thank you, Ray. I think that really tied it back nicely to the point that Anu made earlier about innovation and being open to new models of work and life, as you described. I'd now like to open the Q&A. We have quite a few questions, which I'm very pleased with. And I'd like to go back to Anu, since we didn't have so much time for questions to you. Before I ask that question, I want to respond to a question asked by Ambassador Laura Kennedy. The event will indeed be recorded and available afterwards. So I invite you all to rewatch it if you didn't get enough of it the first time. But the question to Anu that I'd like to ask comes from Samantha Pitts, who is a research associate at the Stimson Center. And what Samantha asks is, As a more junior staff member in a government or international organization, it can be difficult to counter negative/harmful comments and views from more senior colleagues. Do you have any advice on how to do that and how to change those working relationships? For example, how do you let people know that some of the jokes or comments they make are problematic?
Thanks, Louis. I mean, look, I'm not going to I don't want to wax lyrical about how there are perfect systems that exist to be able to do this, because there aren't. I think working with, a lot of my job is working with people that are coming into the field to some extent. And I hear a lot from senior people, even when I joined the field, from senior people being like, oh, you're a young person, you have energy, you can do the advocate work, like you can do the EDI work. You can do the work about, how to make this event more diverse, or like how to make our job advert more diverse. That is problematic. And for many reasons. First of all, you are going to get, we're hoping to see in the trends that we're seeing that the available workforce, I'm not saying these are people that get jobs, but the available workforce within the nuclear field is becoming more diverse. Whether the field is ready to sustainably support a diverse workforce is a different question altogether. And the other problem with that is that the emotional labor that puts on early career people means that it can be difficult for them to focus on their own expertise. So for ages, I was treated like an EDI Alexa or Janet from The Good Place. You can answer all the questions about this. And to some extent, I offered that, when it was my professional mandate to do that as part of my job, a small part of my job, that was fine. But when I made it clear what my boundaries were and they weren't respected, and I was getting emails from people to talk about issues that I don't have lived experience in, that was not okay. And that's not even getting to the point where people make jokes, make racist comments, make homophobic comments in the workplace. And I think while, yes, mechanisms exist and you should, in theory, feel comfortable going to your manager and raising it with them, or productively trying to raise it with the person that did it, even if as I say those words, I know that not everyone is able to do that. And so I can sit here and say to you, you should just be yourself and let the world deal with their own biases. But I know that that's not the truth. And what I will say is look to spaces like this, look to spaces like Out in NatSec, Queer Insecurity, and look to those people and approach them if you feel comfortable enough to ask them for advice, and ask them, because there are people at different stages in their career who will have experienced this, all kinds of isms, all kinds of minorizations, and speak to them about it. But also, if we as a field seriously want to create processes that are safe, then there's a lot of self-reflection that needs to happen. And again, like it comes back to the comment I made earlier, there's a lot of structural changes that need to take place in order to make people feel safe. Some workplaces don't even have a mechanism, don't even have a HR person that they can go to. So as much as that's not the most positive way to frame it, I hope that it provides fuel to be able to create those spaces and have more conversations like this and invite more and more people to them, so that people know who they can approach. They know who might be a safe place for them. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Anu. I think that was really close to reality. So thanks for not sugarcoating things, but also giving some inspirational and optimistic advice. I would like to pose a question, and this is specifically directed to Richard and Laura, but Ray and Anu are also welcomed to respond. And this comes from Joe Dobbs, working as a senior officer in NATO's Nuclear Policy Directorate. He asks, at NATO, there are a range of perspectives on queer issues, and it's easy to fall into the trap of prioritizing what he calls the diplomatic approach over defending the community. How do you go about this in your institution?
So first of all, Joe, thanks for the question. Nice to hear from you. And I like the way that you framed it. I really appreciate what Anu said, a really direct commentary that this is not going to all just be easily done, and we shouldn't sugarcoat any of this. I will also say that I do think it is a bit of a cliche, but I think it is true that representation is power. And I think it is important to be able to the extent that you feel comfortable, to be yourself. And I've tried to do that in very subtle ways. You know, a silly comment in a meeting where, frankly, it's resulted not in my being put into a corner or feeling negative, but actually it's often elicited apologies. It's sort of the opposite, where I've had people actually call and apologize to me because they thought that they had stepped over a line, when in fact I was just being myself. And I said, you have nothing to apologize for. I just wanted to, you know, say something that I would have said if I were in any other space, in a work appropriate setting, of course. And so in terms of being diplomatic versus being more defensive, I don't know that I would even put it that way. I think that there's maybe a third way, which is to just be honest. And to the point of, if somebody says something that is just not accurate, you don't have to necessarily be, you know, you can take whatever tone you want. But there is something to be said for just correcting when things are said that are incorrect. And I also do think that, again, if you feel comfortable, everybody's workspace is different. There's something to be said for just dropping it into casual conversation. What did you do this weekend? I went to see a great drag show, which I did, by the way, very good drag show in DC. And that's really all that you have to do in some cases. So I hesitate even to say that, because I think Anu's point about that things are not going to be that easy is a really good one, but we have to start somewhere. And that's what I do. And that works for me. It may be different for other people, but I try to just make people understand that this is not just a side conversation. It's who I am, and it's part of my life. Over.
All right, did you want to comment on this?
I think Richard's answer is great. I have to say, here in the Vienna organizations, the choice has not yet appeared to me in a year where that's really been an issue, where the two polls that you described. But I do think that part of being a diplomat is being able to say hard truths in a way that does not close off conversation. I am still a novice at this diplomacy stuff, but I think that's an important component of what the US stands for and what we owe it to our fellow citizens and others around the world to call those misstatements out when they get made.
Thanks a lot. The next question I'd like to pull from the Q&A is by John Pope, and it's to Ray. Ray, what are some of the pieces on queer theory around nuclear disarmament that you'd recommend reading? And I would just like to add a small piece of a question that interested me, which is regarding your newest book, Abolishing State Violence, in which you describe a certain risk for disarmament activism to be, how you say, co-opted in the UN system, that there's pressure on people doing activism to fit in, to edit their demands when talking to very senior government officials. So I wonder if you could pull that into your response to John's question.
Yeah, I need to put together a resource list, actually. I've been meaning to do this for a while, but there's there's a few different things. So when I did a podcast interview with Gays Against Guns not too long ago, talking about the relationship and spectrum of violence and queer theory from guns to nuclear weapons. So that could be something of interest. The book also, or both books that Louis mentioned would also be relevant. And, you know, I think what's interesting is that there's not a lot that's specifically written about queer theory and nuclear disarmament. There's more being written about LGBT organizing for disarmament throughout history. So Vincent Ntonde has a book coming out next year that looks at the 1982 mobilization against nuclear weapons that led to the biggest protest in US history. And he covers in that book some of the queer voices and organizers that were involved and how they were marginalized in that process. But there hasn't yet been, I would say, too much written specifically about queer theory and nuclear disarmament. Some of the folks from ICANN Australia and from our group, International Queers Against Nukes, IQAN, which is part of ICANN, has put out some podcasts and short articles. So maybe I can send some links to Louis to be able to circulate to panelists after this event. That might be the easiest way to deal with it. And then in response to your question there, Louis, I think I touched a little bit upon this in my answer previously in terms of the tensions between organizing in terms of mainstream institutions versus those organizing outside of the state or other institutions that have created harm for queer folks. But I think also, you know, the question of co-optation in particular, no one is immune to that, right? Especially when you're working in a job within a government system or a more mainstream think tank. I get to work for a radical feminist organization, so I'm in a slightly different position. But people have to constrain themselves sometimes. And I think, Anu, your points about, you know, even feeling constrained in how you dress. I think I wore a suit to the UN on my first day and never again. But I tried it and I couldn't fit. I felt like I was playing dress up. But I think a lot of people do feel that pressure to conform. And there's also a lot of pressure to hide who you are as a queer person or to present yourself as normal, right? And so this whole, we're just like you, we're no different from you, we have a place at this table the same as you. But as politics, queerness is really about not just challenging our right to be in a space, but to challenge the parameters of that space at its very core. Does this structure, institution, process, does this actually, are we fighting to be in a space that is creating harm in the world, or do we need to build something alternative? So I think that is an area where we can fight co-optation by fighting the system itself.
That was an excellent response, in my opinion. Thank you very much, Ray. And you're certainly describing some of the things that I know other queer colleagues and myself feel in the kind of context where we move in our jobs. The next question I want to ask is a great question. It comes from Jack Brosnan at NTI, and he asks a very hands-on question. I like that. This is to all of you. What are some of the workplace policies you've seen implemented that have best contributed to building an inclusive environment that welcomes queer colleagues? So first dibs, who wants to go?
I'll go, if that's okay.
Yes, please, Anu.
The reason I'm jumping at this is because I am very lucky to work for an organization that centers equity and inclusivity. Both the organizations I've worked for do this, but the one I currently work for has a program dedicated to making the nuclear space and international security as equitable, de-siloed, not just in like people, but in disciplines as possible. And because that's part of our strategy, and it's literally every time we write a strategic document, every time we write a business case, every time we write a concept note, it's not something that we go, oh God, we forgot to invite oh no, everyone is a white man, or oh no, like everyone is from this one space. We don't get to that position because we don't let it happen. It's there from the get-go. We have it as something, you know, when you're writing your business cases, you have a budget. Everyone knows that. You have a summary, you have target audiences. We have EDI in there as well. How are we going to make this not only equitable, diverse, and inclusive, but also accessible? And the accessibility is something that we forget about so much. And the accessibility keeps out people that, you know, disabled people. And it also means that you may have an equitable policy, but you have not created a space that is accessible for people from minoritized backgrounds. So those are some of the things we do. We also do basic things like everyone's email signature has their pronouns in them. You know, no one is asked, we just do it. Everyone is celebrated for who they are. We all talk about our personal lives. We all talk about, you know, and there's no force. You don't have to talk about your personal life if you don't want to. I think a lot of people in this field may not want to share as much as other people do, but you have that choice. And I think that culture has come on not immediately, but it's come on over time as a product of many things, but also of the leadership of that organization and the culture that they have really tried hard to create. So yeah, those two things, it's like incrementally changing things about your internal culture, but also ensuring that EDI and accessibility are strategic rather than tactical, have really helped us.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anu. Who wants to go next?
I'll just say something quickly from my own personal perspective. First of all, hi, Jack. Nice to virtually see you. One of the things that I decided to do as a manager when I started in this job was to meet with every single person on my team one-on-one when I started, and then when new people come on board to do that when they come on board. And I made it a point to note that I care personally about these issues. I care personally about diversity, equity, inclusion, having a safe space at work. As I sometimes note, we spend more time in the office often than we do in our own home lives. So it better be a good place to be. And I do think that comes through. People understand that this is something that I, as a manager, value, and that we as a team should value. And I'm pleased to say that I think that we've seen in my own team, folks want to come work in our team because they know that, and because they know that we not only welcome, but we encourage that kind of environment. And so I know it's very hard, and that's not necessarily the point of this discussion today, but we always talk about the pipeline and how do we bring people into this space. And that's a whole other much more complicated and sometimes cliched discussion. But I think that one of the things that we've seen is we are getting some of the very best people in our organization to come work for us, who also happen to come from these underrepresented communities. And that's the best possible combination. And I don't say that I have any magic words there to say, and that it's because of me per se, but I do think that setting an environment in an office space that says you're welcomed, you're encouraged, you're celebrated, it can't hurt in trying to be able to build that sort of a space. So it's one of a very small piece of much more, as Anu has pointed out and Ray has pointed out, systemic issues that are much more complicated, but I do think it's an important thing to do.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. I'll leave that question open if anybody else wants to jump in. If not, I will ask another. Okay, let's move to the next one. And I want to just ask our panelists, since we have 5 minutes left on the event, to help me decide whether we can go over by a little bit. If you want to just send me a quick signal, would that be okay with your agendas? Okay, great. Then let's go over by a few minutes, and I'll ask one more question, and then we'll turn it to concluding remarks. So this is a question to Laura. And seeing as this definitely depends on support from other member states. I still think it is an interesting question because it is directly about the work that we do here in Vienna. So do you think that the multilateral organizations here, such as the IEA, can and should factor in their policies on recruitment that diversity is much more than gender equality and that it must include the queer community?
Yes, I do think that. But I think we're a long way from that. Part of it is because in many ways the institutions react to directives from member states. And I think we are farther along in a global consensus around gender equality and gender equity than we are around, queer representation and engagement. And so I would be surprised, frankly, if we could get a resolution that would include that. In fact, we saw people fighting directly against that in New York during the NPT review conference, when there were a number of provisions talking about, access of traditionally underrepresented communities to various components of either the decision-making process or the benefits that may come from peaceful applications of nuclear energy and so on. There were loud voices from member states, in that case, states parties, against that. And so I think we have to do more quiet diplomacy in terms of setting expectations for the organizations, in terms of helping them see how their existing policies can be used to expand this sense of where the DEIA focus can go. I think we're very fortunate right now. We have three very powerful gender champions among the three main international institutional leaders here in Vienna, and Director General Rafael Grossi and Executive Secretary Rob Floyd and Executive Director Gada Wali, who are all quite passionate and are showing, improvements on gender balance within their organizations. But we have, I think, quite a ways to go in the international institutions, and I think we have a smaller vocal community among the member states in support of that. And so that means we need to be doing more in our direct engagement with how these organizations work.
That is, if I might say so, an opinion that I share. So thanks so much for bringing that point across. I will sneak in one more tiny little question, and then we will move to closing remarks. This question is from Susan Cohen, and I think that it's an important question to be addressed. So Susan asks that while she has understanding for the injustices that queer people face and have faced, and while she thinks that inclusion is important in language specifically, she takes issue with using they, them as a plural pronoun to denote a single person in order to avoid male, female labeling. So I guess what I want to ask, taking into account this question, is why is it important that even though perhaps for some people it is difficult to adapt their language, that we still do? And I liked when Anu spoke earlier about including pronouns in email signatures without that being something that people are asked to do or have a difficult time to getting around. Why is that important for people? I think we have Ray as the only person here who identifies as non-binary, if I understand, and uses they, them pronouns. So I'd especially like to get your response to this question.
Yeah, so first of all, it's actually a misconception that using they, them as a singular is grammatically incorrect. It is grammatically correct according to every standard English dictionary. So that can be easily looked up. Then it's a matter of wrapping your head around it and using it. And there, I would say, for everybody, sure, it's challenging for anybody that's above, like the generation of kids right now, they get pronouns, no problem. If anybody has young kids. But for all of us, sure, we make mistakes. And if you make a mistake, you correct yourself, you apologize, you move on. It's not a big deal. And so I think those are the two most important things. There's really cool little things you can read on the internet or published material about genderqueer non-binary identities that will help you perhaps reconcile with the they, them pronouns. But what makes it especially important to respect the ways that people identify themselves is, first of all, I think we can recognize an intrinsic value in that, but also because people don't necessarily fit into the binaries that have been socially constructed for us throughout history. These binaries are often Western and imposed colonially on different cultures. So I think that gets to a point that Anu was making earlier as well. It is not necessarily reflected in the way that people have lived or been in the world from the beginning. So I think, just really looking into the nature of this instead of just reacting to a particular pronoun or deciding that it's too challenging to deal with is very important for anybody that's interested in being a real ally to the trans and non-binary element of the queer community. Happy if anybody else wants to pitch in though too. It doesn't have to be only the non-cis person weighing in.
Anu, did I see your hand?
Yeah, I'm like married to a non-binary person, and when I met them, they weren't non-binary to me. But as Ray said, that was my first reaction. Firstly, they, them is not incorrect in the singular use. But also, if it makes someone comfortable and it makes them feel seen and identified, then why is that what I struggle with is, why is that a problem? And I don't want to assume, Susan, that you were trying to sort of indicate that it is a problem. But if it makes someone feel safe, it makes them feel comfortable, and it makes them feel like they can frankly exist and do their job as themselves, I don't think that, and note that I'm saying someone and themselves as I say this naturally. It's not something that I'm thinking about, it's just how we naturally speak in English. Then I don't think it's a problem. And in so many languages, I speak Hindi as well as I speak English, I speak Gujarati as well as I speak English. Objects have gender, but when you're talking in respect, there is only one like sort of pronoun that you use for everyone. So yeah, I'm gonna stop there.
I was just going to note, first of all, I love that we're having this discussion, but I also really respect that we've mentioned several times here, and both Ray and Anu have, that this is a very Western conception. And we have gotten very good in the world, talking about diplomacy earlier, about respecting how other people refer to themselves in their own languages or in their own cultures. This is, in my view, just part of that same thing. The queer culture is a culture. And if you're going to want to make sure you're respectful to your colleagues from around the world, and make sure you refer to them by the appropriate title, or in respect of how that language or that construct is made up, why would you not want to do the same thing for others who have taken this step to make clear how they feel comfortable? And in fact, I actually think in some ways the putting your pronoun in your signature line is in some ways the least that you can do. I don't say that to be negative, but it's a very easy thing to do to signal your allyship and to respect that different people identify in different ways. And that's okay. And we should just do it. To quote the old Nike ad, just do it.
That's fantastic. I'll leave it open there for a few more seconds in case I want to add any more to that. But if not, then I think we should move to concluding remarks, and I'd like to do it the other way around this time. So I'd like to start with Ray. Please share with us in 60 seconds what you want to convey and what you want our audience to take away from this event.
I think the main thing that I would love if folks can take away is that, you know, within the queer community, there is a lot of diversity. And so I think we've seen that very clearly here. And I think having diverse representation in terms of geography and orientation and identity is important, but so is diversity of policy views. And Richard said that at the beginning. So I just really want to echo that. And I think these are the kinds of conversations that I hope people will be inspired to have, and that, you know, we can conduct these conversations safely across many different approaches and thinking and backgrounds to these issues, as well as to our own identities, and that it is possible to have really interesting dynamic conversations and eventually, you know, even reach solutions on some of these really thorny issues that we're grappling with. So thanks very much for including me, and I hope these conversations continue beyond this webinar.
Thank you so much, Ray. Laura, you're next.
Well, I've learned a ton this afternoon. I'm smarter than when we first signed on. So I just really want to give thanks to the fellow panelists and to the really thoughtful questions from you, Louis, and from the audience. I think keeping a learning mindset front and center as we navigate this space, especially those of us who are allies and not necessarily living within the space, to be humble about what we don't know, to be curious but not invasive, I think are all important lessons that we can take away.
Such an important point. Thank you, Laura. And Anu, please.
So in my closing remarks, I kind of want to address the last question that was asked, the anonymous attendees question, which is, we can very clearly create spaces where you can be who you are, but they need to be, that allyship in that space needs to be an ethical space. It needs to be one where you feel safe and that, you know, these things aren't used to your advantage or disadvantage. So being the systems theory nuts that I am, this is interconnected. This is an interconnected issue. It's connected to identity, but it's also connected to the framework within which we operate. And if you want, you know, we claim so much we want the best idea to win in this field. So if you don't have a field where the best ideas can survive, they're just not going to come through. So thank you for this conversation. It was quite cathartic.
Thanks so much, Anu. I'm glad to hear that it's also had an effect on our panelists, as Laura has also shared. So Richard, you're our last panelist. Please, 60 seconds for you.
I'll be brief. First of all, I want to say again, thank you for doing this. I think it's really important. And one of the things that I love about these kinds of discussions is that I learn something as well, as a panelist, and not just as sorry, I seem to be having a Wi-Fi issue, so I will just go on to the cloud. But I was just going to say, I learn a lot from these experiences. I learn a lot from these panels. And it's a reminder, even for us in our own queer community, to know our history and to know where we have come from, so that we know where we're going. And so I think these kinds of discussions are helpful for our own community. And I hope they're helpful for folks who may not be necessarily part of the queer community by identity, but who want to be allies and want to, you know, make things better. And so I just really appreciate these discussions. And I don't think that we're going to solve all the problems in one panel. So we should have more, but we also have a lot more work to do in many other spaces. So, but thank you to VCDNP for facilitating what's been a really fascinating and enlightening discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will hand the floor to Elena to close the event in a second, but I just want to say I'm so chuffed with how this event has gone. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you to Richard and to Laura for dedicating your time and for giving very high level support to this event. Thank you to Anu for addressing some of the reactions that we'd received and for giving really good responses. And thank you to Ray for highlighting some of the perspectives that do sometimes go underrepresented in this field. So I'm just extremely delighted. I'll say a final big thank you, and I'll hand it to Elena to close the event.
Thank you so much, Louis. And what I'm taking away is mostly that I'm even more convinced that we did when we made that decision to organize and host this event, that it was something that is extremely important, and I'm fully supported. And I'm so proud of Louis and all of my colleagues who supported it full way. I'm also grateful to all of you, dear panelists, for sharing. And these are difficult conversations. Sometimes some of you are a little bit more comfortable maybe in this space, but there are many people who were listening, and I can tell that they really appreciated it. And not everybody is comfortable speaking about these experiences, and even some questions came as anonymous. So that is an indication that we do need to continue these conversations. And but there are many good questions that we were not able to address it. And I hope we will have other opportunities and maybe other discussions to go into that. But to highlight one more time, we'll have the recording of this panel available in a few days. And we hope that you learned as much and appreciated the views and the points shared as I am. So with that, everybody has a fantastic rest of your day and in the week. We're getting to the holidays, and everybody have a really nice and cheerful time around the holidays and into the next year. Thank you all.